the point you make about what we're told is exactly right. Almost every day, maybe every day, we're told in the mainstream press that the war in Ukraine is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th, 2022. This neglects the fact that the war actually has been going on since 2014, though not with this intensity, and it absolutely aims to separate us from any historical context. The word unprovoked is, of course, a tendentious word. It's a word with a narrative purpose. It's false. Of course, there are reasons for this war. There are antecedents. There were warnings, none of which were heeded by the United States. But in any event, this is not a war that came out of the blue just because suddenly that day President Putin wanted to recreate the Russian Empire, which is more or less how we're told. But rather, this is part of politics and geopolitics.
This was Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I had a chance to interview him a while back, twice actually, but the interview did not get the attention that it deserves. I suspect that YouTube's mighty algorithm did not really appreciate his message, which is why we tried now in a different format. We have distilled some of the most powerful moments from those interviews. Edited for clarity, you'll hear Professor Sachs without my questions and commentary. If you want the full context, there's a link to the complete interview in the description. But what you will hear now first are two personal anecdotes of a man who actually was present when history unfolded and who consequently was rudely silenced in televised programs for speaking the uncomfortable truth. Professor Sachs then continues on to discuss the war in Ukraine and exposes how our media's complicity might lead us down the road towards nuclear Armageddon. I think his words are a wake-up call that none of us can afford to ignore.
That was an unusual moment. We were indeed in the Kremlin in a huge office room, and President Yeltsin came from the far door, walked across the room to our group, which was about 10 economists invited to help advise the economic team of President Yeltsin. The president sat down, and his first words were, "I can tell you we have just ended the Soviet Union." And then he pointed to the back door. He said, "In that next room, I was meeting with the heads of the military, and they have agreed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union." So those were the first words that we heard. Absolutely unbelievable. Well, let me say on the Athens one, it's a little bit true. I speak a lot, so and I talk too much. I'm not talking about the content. I'm talking about the time. So I think the moderator there from the New York Times was basically saying give others a chance, but he cut me off at a crucial moment when I was making an important point that I wanted to make. But in any event, I put that one aside. The other one was pretty humorous in a way and pretty frustrating because I was invited to a show that I've been on a number of times. I had the audacity to say that I thought the United States had been the country that took out the Nord Stream pipeline, something I believe to this moment. Maybe the UK did it together with the US, but definitely this was a US job together with some allied countries. This wasn't Russia, and it's pretty obvious, actually, for a lot of reasons that that's the case. But when I said it, that violated absolutely the party line in the United States. And I know that these interviewers, they have earpieces where the producers say, "Get this guy to stop, get this guy to stop. That's outrageous. We can't have this." So I just watched the faces of my interviewers, and they stopped me cold. Usually I'm on for, half an hour on the show. It was about 5 minutes. And then one of them just went on an attack for 5 minutes. They didn't cut me off the Zoom so I could watch the show, but I couldn't participate. And he just went after me personally for 5 minutes. "This is an ignoramus. He knows nothing. Why do we have an economist talking about this, despite the fact that I've been in global diplomacy for decades actually, and involved with these countries. So it's disheartening when we're talking about such important issues that we can't have an open discussion about them. And there's a lot of lying that's going on. Governments lie. Even Churchill said the truth is so precious that it has to be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. In wartime, governments lie. Okay, we can understand that. It's a game they're playing. They're using these lies for strategic purposes. But the media used to, as I understood it, take a critical view to this and say, okay, the government said this, but now we're going to look a little more deeply at that. That's what a media in a democracy really should be doing. Not just saying that some unnamed U.S. official said it was Russia that did it, that kind of thing. There should be an open skepticism because we're a democracy. Governments lie, so the public needs to have an understanding what's true, what isn't true. And we are engaged in so many lies right now. I think the Nord Stream is an example, by the way, a big consequence for Europe, because somebody blew up critical infrastructure and deprived Europe of its a crucial energy source. And then when the Swedes investigated, by the way, they say, oh, for national security reasons, we can't even share our findings with Denmark and Germany. Huh? What could that mean? Well, what it means is that we are in a terrible war right now, very dangerous, between the United States and Russia. The U.S. is using whatever means, not all so far, but we're on a path of escalation to nuclear war. It means that something as shocking as blowing up international infrastructure is part of it, but even more shocking than blaming it on the Russians. Now, that is absolutely dangerous, to do something so provocative and then blame it on the Russians. But that's par for the course. One of the things I was about to mention is the extremely dangerous shelling of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Now, the Russians seized that power plant early in the war, and the Ukrainians have been trying to recapture it. And part of recapturing it has been shelling the power plant, which is a no-no. Do not shell a nuclear power plant, thank you. But our media say each side accuses the other of shelling the nuclear power plant. One side controls it, the other side is trying to retake it. Who's actually doing the shelling? The one that controls it? No, the one that's trying to retake it. But our media are just fed nonsense by government. If we had the gumption to say, Ukraine is shelling the nuclear power plant, stop it. You're our ally, but that is dangerous. Stop that dangerous behavior. The world would be a lot safer. I think it's obvious the United States did it, perhaps together with the UK. But this is obvious. We have the motive, the means, the opportunity, the statements, and the behavior of the governments in Europe. It's obvious. If there's something different, someone should say it and explain it. We apparently have, it's not verified, but we also apparently have tweets that were collected also by Russian intelligence and so forth, showing that the UK was involved. Or not tweets, I think it's an iPhone message, apparently reportedly from Liz Truss. This is very, very clear. If the president says we have our means, and I've been, living and watching this for decades, the United States destroys infrastructure of other countries. That's not an unusual thing to do. It's just that we're trying to be democracies. We're trying to understand. We're trying to save ourselves from Armageddon. We're trying to understand what's really happening. And it's not acceptable, in my view, that governments just lie or shut their mouths about this without explaining the realities of what's going on. Well, it's vital for Russia because it's on the border, and that's period. The same way that the U.S. would not much cotton a China-Mexico military alliance, which is probably the closest analogy one could have. Why is it crucial for the United States? It's not. It's part of a U.S. game, but it's not crucial. What Brzezinski said is it's a geographical pivot. He said, he who controls Ukraine will control Eurasia. The idea was that if Ukraine is firmly in the NATO camp, then Russia is at best a regional power, but not even that. It can no longer project power in the Eastern Mediterranean. It loses its hold on the Black Sea. It's basically bottled up in Asia. And Brzezinski said, so this is part of the grand chessboard. And he said, the U.S. has a good shot at this, but what it should do is avoid driving Russia and China together, but that's so unlikely. But that's exactly what U.S. policy has actually done. So the U.S. views this as a geopolitical chessboard. The Russia views this as a national security issue that is absolutely the red line. Well, if you take these two, this is an explosive combination, and it's been explosive for decades now. But it was already in 2008 when George W. Bush Jr. incredibly irresponsibly pushed NATO to say that Ukraine would become a member at the Bucharest summit. And the next day, it happened that the following day was the NATO-Russia meeting that year, and Putin told Bush, if you do this, we take Crimea. The Russian fleet has been in Crimea since 1783. Thank you very much. And so what the U.S. was proposing was incredibly provocative. It was, like we started, tantamount to saying, okay, we're going to make military bases in Cuba, tantamount to the Soviet Union saying that. The analogy is not perfect, but in any event, for Russia, the red line was absolutely clear. Things went to a simmer in 2010, 2011, 2012, because there was a pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who said wisely, Ukraine will be neutral. Now, neutrality keeps Ukraine from being the battleground between two nuclear superpowers. That's the smart position. Well, the Bucharest 2008 statement says that Georgia and Ukraine will join NATO, period. It's very clear. What happened was that Bush pushed this. The Europeans knew better, so they didn't offer some kind of roadmap immediately, but Bush pushed through in the Bucharest statement at the end that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. And that became U.S. policy, it became NATO policy, endlessly repeated since then. There's no ambiguity about it. What is ironic and interesting is that European leaders knew very well then that this was absolutely provocative. But they don't speak in public. They're afraid of the United States. And so, unfortunately, the European public doesn't even hear from its own leaders the real situation about things like this. The day after this declaration was the scheduled NATO-Russia meeting. So actually, Putin was in Bucharest the next day, and he said to Bush, if you push NATO expansion to Ukraine, we take back Crimea. It was very clear. Putin has been completely against this, as was Yeltsin, as was Gorbachev. The whole issue of NATO enlargement has been a provocation now for 30 years. and NATO bombed Belgrade for 41 days in 1999, and Putin took some attention to that because Serbia was an ally of Russia, and NATO, without UN approval, but because Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke and Bill Clinton said so, bombed Belgrade. Then NATO bombed Muammar Gaddafi, his regime, out of existence in 2011. Again, completely contrary to the purposes of the UN Security Council resolution about Libya, which was about protecting civilian populations, not overthrowing governments. So it's just a typical Western propaganda. These lines are repeated. They are not scrutinized in the mainstream media. This is what politicians do for a living. They repeat this kind of statement without any commitment to the truth, I'm afraid. I thought exactly that German technology and Russian resources, and by the way, very intelligent and well-educated people, was a potent combination that could lead to the economic rise of Russia. And I thought, that's exactly what we want. Not what we're trying to prevent, but exactly what we want. That's the goal of economic development. So it's an interesting statement, which I hadn't heard, but it shows, if you think like an American unipolar neocon, then the game is keep others down. If you think like I do and like I think we should, it is how do we get mutual gain? And it's not, economic development is not a zero-sum game. It's something that absolutely is to be promoted, in my opinion, also with China and so forth. But to a strategist that's interested in a unipolar U.S. world, the game is prevent the rise of your competitors. It's a very dangerous game. Other countries don't like their rise to be prevented. Recently, we have the shock that Russia has discontinued the grain export agreement out of the Black Sea ports. But there was an attack by the UK intelligence combined with Ukraine on the Sevastopol Russian fleet. Do our media discuss that attack? No. They just have the voices how evil that Russia does what it's doing to stop the agreement. We cannot get out of this mess if all we're doing is attacking the other without understanding of what we are doing. I often talk about Jesus's foreign policy advice, which is, why do you point to the mote in the other eye when you have a beam in your own eye, from the Gospels? And the point is, if all we're doing is attacking Russia, even falsely, when we know that it's not Russia doing it, then what do people expect to happen other than the worst kinds of outcomes? We need truth to get out of this crisis. It's absolutely the refusal of the mainstream media to present any serious discussion of these matters that is the real problem. The goal of our government is historical amnesia. I think Orwell put it right when he said, he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. So the goal is control the past. Don't tell what really happened. But it's quite clear what really happened. We know there were mass public protests, but we also know that senior U.S. officials were stirring those protests, some in a very direct way. Our Senator John McCain, for example, went and spoke to the crowds, cheering them on, as if some foreign politician came to Trump's crowd on January 6, 2021 and said, oh, go for it. In other words, America was blatantly inserting itself into this, but there was a lot of behind the scenes role of the United States. One of that was captured on the phone of Victoria Nuland, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. And she was captured on a phone call, probably by Russian intelligence and subsequently made public, saying who was going to be in the next government. The U.S. was engaging in participation in a regime change activity. This is not to deny their public protest, but it's to say that the U.S. played a hidden hand in a lot of this. I know that firsthand that it did, because I saw some NGOs, what they were doing, U.S. NGOs stirring the Maidan, supporting the insurrection, and so on. So I think there's a lot of U.S. meddling, and Putin said, well, this was a coup that was led by the United States. I don't know if it can be exactly characterized this way. It was an insurrection absolutely stirred in part by the United States. U.S. operations are covert. Everything is therefore subject to lies when it comes to the public presentation. We're never told as American citizens what our government is actually doing in reality. None of it's explained. Our government officials lie rampantly all the time, and you have to ferret this out. Those academic studies you cite are part of that process. I know academics that have spent years on trying to analyze what happened, and in fact, where the snipers came from, and how we blamed the Yanukovych government for things that, according to these academics, absolutely was from the opposing side. So we should understand, and I think many people outside the United States, I would say, unfortunately, most people in the United States do not understand what the CIA does, how it operates, its covert actions, and not just the CIA, but many agencies of the U.S. government. They do things secretly to steer the politics of other countries. And as soon as Yanukovych was chased out, we recognized a new regime, an insurrectionist regime, not saying, no, that's not the Constitution. There was an agreement, President Yanukovych is president, and there should be new elections down the road. No, the United States immediately recognized the government that it wanted. So even on the surface, the behavior is absolutely inappropriate. American officials, I think rightly, go wild when foreign governments try to intervene in the U.S., but the U.S. does it absolutely routinely in other places. And that double standard is not satisfactory because it puts us in great danger. Basically, the role of the U.S. dollar is one part of U.S. Global power. The dollar is used for settling transactions. It's used for borrowing and lending. It's used for the denomination of transactions. It's the key global reserve currency. So a significant proportion, 50 or 60% of international trade are settled in dollars, and that means really settled through the banking system that uses dollars. The U.S. has militarized or politicized this system, especially in the last 10 years. It's done it in a number of countries, basically by using its power to deny adversary regimes of their access to this dollar-based system. Examples of that are Iran and Venezuela. But in 2022, after the Russian invasion, on February 24th, the U.S. and its allies basically blocked Russia from most of the use of the dollar-based banking system, and the United States government led the seizure of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. Really incredible, just freezing the bank balances that are Russia's bank balances. And the numbers vary, but something on the order of $300 billion of the government's foreign exchange reserves seized. Well, it doesn't take a PhD in economics to know if you don't see eye to eye with the U.S. government, don't leave your reserves in dollars. And by the way, this followed the seizure of Afghanistan's $8 billion of foreign exchange reserves as well. So basically, the U.S. has turned the dollar into a geopolitical instrument. But there are other ways to transact. You can use other currencies, and you can use third parties, and you can barter in certain ways, and so on. And to my mind, what the U.S. is doing is undermining the role of the dollar, which has given the U.S. certain financial advantages. And I think in 10 years, even before then, Russia, India, the BRICS, as you say, other countries will move to other kinds of payments. This will be accelerated also by using currencies like the digital renminbi, which is already on the way. And much of this is actually in a pretty advanced state of transformation. Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia are already using non-dollar transactions for a lot of their international trade right now, and the trend will surely continue. The United States cannot continue to make these kinds of unilateral interventions, which I think are pretty outrageous, actually, I have to say. I'm not a fan of them at all. But it can't do it and expect that the role of the dollar remains as preeminent as it has been in the past. It won't be the case. Many in Ukraine, in the government and elsewhere, think that somehow I'm taking President Putin's line. It's absolutely not the point. The point I'm making is that the United States maneuvered, and sadly, the Ukrainian government accepted getting in the middle of a proxy war. And if I were in Ukraine's position, and what I tried to warn them and told them, don't fall into this trap of being the battleground between Russia and the United States. You'll end up like Afghanistan in Europe. And by Afghanistan, I mean the United States was there blowing up the place for decades, and then one day it left, and the place has been completely ravaged and turned to rubble and every kind of damage. And that's after the U.S. engagement from actually 1979 onward. It's not just from 2001 when we had an open invasion. It's typical for the U.S. that the CIA went into Afghanistan in 1979 to give funding to jihadists that later on would become Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. This is no joke, with the idea of trying to precipitate a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So the kind of recklessness of these games by the U.S. Leaves countries in ruins, and Afghanistan is a victim, and sad to say, Ukraine is a victim too, unless we move to negotiations.
A quick call to action. Some of the best interviews on this channel are shadow banned, which means YouTube is not presenting them to you, the viewer. The latest example is my interview with James Bamford, where we discussed the truly amazing story that underlies Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption scandal. Did you know that a Hollywood billionaire not only stole nuclear secrets from America, but then sold them to Israel? and that Netanyahu helped him to stay out of troubles to this very day? And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors, hence the bribery charges in Israel against him. Other examples are the interviews with the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen, or the interview with the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, who told me that the white powder in the test tube that Colin Powell showed the world when he testified at the UN just before the war on Iraq was actually salt. So if you're interested in content that apparently you're not supposed to see, content that goes against the mainstream narrative, have a look at some of the previous interviews that we have recorded for your pleasure. And of course, it really helps to spread the news if you like and subscribe to this channel.